My name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. Forests are dispensaries of many basic necessities for human survival and stores for our future well-being. But here's the problem when it comes to climate. Humankind has been stripping food and firewood from the shelves for centuries without giving much thought to restocking them, thus threatening to bring about irreparable imbalances to Earth's natural system. Every minute of every day, the equivalent of nearly 50 football fields of forest cover is destroyed, along with the endangered species they harbor. An area of woodland twice the size of France has been lost since 1990, mainly to the rapid expansion of agriculture to feed a population that has grown from 5.3 billion in 1990 to 7.3 billion today, and is set to balloon to 9 billion by mid-century and more than 11 billion by 2100. Unfortunately, the world's forests are disappearing at the same time. Forests come in many types: evergreen jungles in warm, moist areas with trees that sprout leaves all year round, deciduous forests in more temperate regions with trees which lose their foliage at the end of the growing season, and coniferous ones with cone-bearing pines and needle-like leaves growing in very cold places. Two key forested zones are the dense, lush tropical rainforests found around the equator, stretching from the South American Amazon through Africa's Congo Basin to Indonesia in Southeast Asia, and the boreal forests, which crosses North America and Eurasia. Forests cover about 30% of Earth's total land area, second only to agriculture, which occupies about 40%. About 10% of forests are in the form of plantations. Much more than just a collection of trees, forests regulate rainfall, provide food, fuel, and building material, about a fifth of the oxygen we breathe, and house 80% of the world's known land-bound plant and animal species. Dozens of types of medical drugs are sourced from plants in tropical forests. According to the environment NGO WWF, forests provide direct shelter to some 300 million people, and more than 1 billion depend on them for living, many of whom harvest the forests directly for the bushmeat, berries, and fruit that sustains them. Forests also serve a long overlooked but vital function by locking in vast amounts of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas blamed for altering Earth's climate system. And they play an important economic role as well. The forest sector contributes about $600 billion annually to global GDP and provides employment to more than 50 million people. Yet forest cover has nearly halved since humans first began to clear trees to plant seeds and raise animals. The planet's largest rainforest, the Amazon, has shrunk by nearly a fifth in the last 50 years, and the Indonesian island of Sumatra has lost about 85% of its tree cover. Agriculture is by far the biggest usurper of forest land, but other culprits include logging for fuel, building materials, paper and pulp, mining, and oil exploration. After millennia of unbridled exploitation, humans have recently come to recognize that this valuable resource is not infinite and needs our help to recover. About 13% of the world's forests today are protected, and reforestation projects to replace lost tree cover have mixed success. In Brazil, for instance, there has been a reduction of about 70% in deforestation from its peak about a decade ago. In Indonesia, however, scientists say tree killing has continued unabated, and the country has overtaken Brazil as the world's top deforester. Overall, the global rate of deforestation has slowed, but losses still far outpace conservation and replanting efforts. And new forests do not offer the same benefits as old ones. Settled forests offer better shelter to a larger array of plants and animal species, and a recent study found that big, old trees do more than small young ones to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Despite the obvious value in protecting forests in the long run, there is a conflict with the short-term need to clear land for growing the grain, fruit, and meat required to feed a rapidly expanding world population. hundreds of millions of whom are already chronically hungry. Agriculture is one of the most destructive forms of land use, not only eating into forests, but also changing the chemical composition of soil, stripping the land of life-giving bacteria, harming the environment with pesticides and fertilizers, and using up precious fresh water. It is also a major contributor to climate change. The cultivation of rice, for example, a staple starch for billions of people, is mankind's major emitter of methane, a shorter-lived greenhouse gas than CO2, but much more potent in trapping heat. Cattle farming, too, is a major methane emitter. The UN has said food production must increase by 60% by 2050, by when the world population is estimated to hit 9.6 billion. So how do we meet the twin challenges of generating food while protecting valuable forests? The answer lies partly in improving production yield, which means extracting more volume of crops or meat per acre of land farmed. This can be achieved, for example, through crop rotation, which involves growing different types of plant in succession in the same field, thereby not allowing pests to settle, and replenishing the soil with nutrient-rich crops. There is also the controversial solution of genetic modification, engineering seeds and produce that are not only more resilient to pests and inclement weather, but also more nutritious. Changing consumer behavior will also be key. The Food and Agriculture Organization says roughly 1/3 of food produced, some 1.3 billion tons per year, is lost in the supply chain or simply thrown away. There is a common threat to both forests and agriculture, and that is climate change. As the average temperature on Earth rises, forests face a heightened risk from insects, disease, drought, and fires. Farmland faces similar threats, as well as production losses from heat stress, droughts, storms, and floods. It is a vicious circle. Deforestation and farming contribute to emissions of greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, which leads in turn to further warming. Trees are key to combating climate change. They take CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow and lock it away in plant matter and soil. Removing trees not only inhibits this crucial process, but also causes CO2 gas to escape from the newly exposed and decaying organic matter. Tropical forests also produce clouds, which radiate sunlight back out of the atmosphere, cooling the earth and counteracting warming. Deforestation is blamed for about 10% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Halting deforestation is a key focus of UN diplomats negotiating for a global pact to limit disastrous climate change. It is also one of the International Forum's few successes. A plan dubbed REDD+ has been adopted, which offers financial rewards from rich nations to poor ones for reducing deforestation. A recent scientific census found there were about 3 trillion trees on Earth, roughly 420 for every person alive. This may sound like a lot, but it's not. And at the rate we are felling them, some 15 billion a year, we will have no one but ourselves to blame if we eventually run out. We recently interviewed an expert on forests in relation to climate change at the UN talks on climate change in Bonn. Here's what she had to say.
Key areas of focus are tropical forests, because in a lot of temperate regions there's control. We're not seeing major changes. There's still logging going on, but the major changes in the forest stock are happening in the tropical areas. In terms of whether that's increasing or decreasing, it's actually an area of hot debate, and there are great differences between what's reported. So the FAO releases reports where countries report the changes in their forests, but then when you compare that to remote sensing, so satellite-based systems to assess what's happening by looking at images, there are differences. But globally, it's a very hot area for debate, and as better satellites come on board, new ways to measure things come on board, we're seeing more and more accurate assessments. So we'll have a better picture in future. But we know that generally, if we're looking in the decades time frame, forests are going to be under increasing risk. because of growing population. We know that agriculture, demand for food is the major driver of deforestation, and we know that populations are going to increase and people are getting wealthier, the middle class is growing, and so consumption is going to increase.
Apart from agriculture, how else do humans encroach on forests?
There's a number of different ways. Timber harvesting is a key one. Mining, so there's lots of different, gold mining, and it can cause pollution. And then oil exploration is another key one. But as we see it, agriculture is the largest and a growing threat. But pulp and paper production as well is another important one, especially in the tropics.
It really doesn't seem to make any sense that we would destroy this crucial resource for us in so many ways.
No, exactly. Especially when it comes to producing timber, pulp and paper and food, you don't need to do that in a forest. You don't need to use a forest. You can use degraded land or existing land or well-managed plantations for pulp and paper. Where it becomes difficult is, for example, gold stores and oil stores. That's very tricky, especially for developing countries that understand they have a resource that provides a lot of money for them potentially. How do you encourage them to keep those resources in the ground? That's a big challenge, and where mechanisms are being developed to try and support developing countries to protect their forests.
The growing population and the growing demand for food that goes with that, and therefore the expansion of agriculture, is that incompatible with protecting our forests?
We don't believe that it is. It's certainly a huge challenge. I mean, one of the greatest challenges we're facing in the coming decades is how we're going to feed a population which, people assume that by 2050 we'll need something like 60% more food. And how do we do that without destroying forests, which tend to be the big areas for expansion? But we believe two things. First of all, that it's possible. There are studies of specific areas. I focus on Brazil, for example, where there's lots of really great studies showing that if you restore degraded pasture and also improve the management of cattle pasture, which occupy about 2/3 of cleared land in the Amazon, you can have 2 or 3 times more cows per hectare, and so you can increase the beef production on less land, and that's freed up land you can use for other crops. So we know it's possible, but it's going to take a lot of effort. The second point there is that if you fail to protect your forests, you're going to have major detrimental impacts on agriculture, because we know that rainfall is the ecosystem service of water is a very important one of tropical forests, and there's been recent studies out attributing the recent droughts and problems throughout Brazil's had a major drought in the south of Brazil to lack of forest in the Amazon. So the rainfall that's so important to agriculture won't be there without forests. So we think it's actually essential to protect forests while you're increasing food production.
So here are a few tips for journalists when we're talking about forests and agriculture. First, a general one that would really apply to any of these climate stories. Before you start writing, take a step back and think, how would you pitch this story to your sister or your mother in a way that they would understand it and that they would find it compelling? Remember that you're writing for a lay audience. Second key point, following on the first one, keep it simple, and to the extent you can, avoid jargon. You may know what a carbon sink is, but most people don't. So if you do have to use a term like that, make sure you explain it in passing if possible. Third point, again, a basic one. Make sure that you compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges, and not apples and oranges. If you're talking about land loss, you can't jump from there, for example, to talking about the number of trees planted using the same metrics. This is, again, true across all the climate stories, and sometimes it can get tricky. Carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent, for example, are not the same thing, so make sure that you're using the same measures. Final tip on this segment, in writing this story and others, use a variety of sources. NGOs, for example, do marvelous work and often issue very serious reports, but it's always good to balance that if you can with scientific sources, academic sources that may be more neutral in relation to a particular topic. So that's it for this segment. We'll see you next time. Here are a few simple key points to remember about forests and climate change. Forests are key to mankind's physical and economic survival. We are destroying this precious, finite resource at breakneck speed. Something can be done about it, including through changing farming practices. Agriculture is the main threat and the main culprit. And finally, something must be done, or life on Earth as we know it will change forever.